everybody. Thanks for coming back to the Evolution of Sport Talks. Up next, we have a senior at Duke University and a developing NASCAR driver. With that, I'd like to welcome Paul Haraka to the stage. Oh, sorry.
This way?
Yeah, good luck.
Thanks. Does this work? Yes, it does. Sweet. So as Krishna said, we'll jump right into driver development, and I guess obviously the first thing is why I'm relevant. So personally, I started racing when I was 7 years old, 22 now. So I've been doing it for a little while and have won at all different levels, and we'll talk more about the levels as we get into the deck. I'm currently in NASCAR's Camping World Truck Series, which you see the picture on the bottom. That was actually at Daytona 5 days ago. So we raced there and had a lot of fun. Didn't have the result we wanted, but that happens. As you mentioned, I'm a senior at Duke, and I'll mention this at the end. We won't get too far into it, but we ended up here. I started a venture with Daryl Morey about 4 months ago, centered around some of these inefficiencies. So big picture, kind of the outline of what we'll talk about is how motorsports is a really unique environment as sports go, for some reasons that may not be initially apparent. Then we'll talk about the NASCAR ladder and how drivers climb, then into some of the analytics of the sport, and then what outcomes do we know from that, and what do we think might happen. So motorsports is unique in a lot of key ways, but there are some specific functional differences that separate racing from any of the other major league sports, not least of which is the fact that it's a one-on-one sport, but bigger than that is that we're not a franchise sport. So the interaction between the athletes, the teams, and the sanctioning body is completely different. NASCAR is a private company owned by the same family that founded it 62 years ago. All the teams are private companies. The drivers are generally independent subcontractors. Completely different. And the sanctioning body really doesn't interfere at all with the driver and the team relationship. So there are no salary caps. There are no controls. There is no drivers union. Drivers attempted to form one long before I was born, and that was kind of busted very quickly. So those controls don't exist. And then finally, as a sport, we're very, very, very equipment dependent. And every sport, to a certain extent, is equipment dependent. But there's certainly diminishing returns in a lot of equipment areas, and that's what leads a lot of the innovation here in new areas of equipment. But as a sport, man, we depend on a race car more than most other sports would. And the point of differentiation between winning and not winning is, quite frankly, less in my hands than it is even in the crew chief's hands. It's very dependent on that equipment. And that equipment is certainly really expensive, and we'll talk more about that, and then the separation between different teams. So big picture, this is generally the ladder that drivers climb. So you could liken this to any other sport where, laser works. Drivers generally start out in go-karts. Like I said, I started out when I was 7. Up to kind of the next layer, 3/4 scale cars. So I did that when I was about 15, which is pretty average. Some drivers younger, some older. The triangle represents series that are actually sanctioned by NASCAR. I think it's useful to separate these, to use a baseball analogy. You consider this, NASCAR's Whelen All-American Series are single A. This whole block of 5 series are double A. These 2 is our triple A, and then obviously the Sprint Cup Series is our majors. ARCA and USAC, which sit off to the sides, they're non-NASCAR sanctioned series. They're sanctioning bodies off on their own that are about equal with the K&N Pro Series. So I, right now, am at that level. How much this costs, which is why this is relevant here, and what those ranges are. So, to throw some numbers out there, here's ballpark what teams are at. And the big difference in what really separates one team from another and where the root of this inefficiency lies is, to go back to what we talked about earlier on the equipment thing, how much the range is. So I've thrown up here average numbers of about what teams spend. In the NASCAR Camping World Truck Series, you'll have teams that campaign for the full season on about $1.5 million, and you'll have teams that campaign on about $3.5 million. Now, plane fares, US Airways charges everybody the same. Hotels are the same. The big differentiation there is teams that are literally spending 8, 9, 10 times the amount on R&D as other teams. That's where equipment becomes very differentiated. And as a driver, if you're not in good equipment, if you're not in equipment with a team that has the financial resources to put great race cars on the racetrack, you just can't show what you're capable of. There are some analytics that can start to separate drivers out, but it's very, very, very difficult. So what that capital dependence has done to the sport. Now, when you look at how drivers climb the ladder, Previously, when guys like Jeff Gordon and Jimmy Johnson and Carl Edwards climbed, there's independent sponsors at every level along this ladder. And for this purpose, we'll just look at the NASCAR ladder. At every level along this ladder, that sponsor a race team derived some marketing or other benefit out of it, and that race team hired the best driver and put that driver in the car. That changed a lot to the point that now, unless you have some source of personal private capital, you can't climb the ladder. So for this purpose, we'll look at the Camping World Truck Series just as an example and what the young driver population has looked like over the years. So when you look at this graph, every year from, 04 through 2011, the blue line quite simply represents a team who is in the series, who has a sponsor, and who goes out and hires the best driver. The green line represents a team-driver combination where that driver is there not necessarily because he's proven that he has a talent, but because he has some form of financial backing, whether that's a wealthy family or a family company or something like this. So as I mentioned at the beginning, it was all just about drivers with talent. NASCAR gained a lot of popularity in the 90s. Kids got involved in the sport. Those drivers come of age. Mid-2000s, those drivers may not necessarily have the talent to break into this series, but they have the money to do it, and they're able to write a check and do it. What happened in 08 changed a lot of things, and our sport was certainly one of them. So you get to a point at the end of 2008 where all of these teams are looking for, where's our revenue stream? Where's our money going to come from? And sponsors weren't willing to spend at the levels they were previously willing to spend at. This puts teams in panic mode, as I think anybody would be. And what you had was a lot of wealthy drivers who said, hey, I've got an uncle that can write a check or something like this. And that's where you see the huge shift from 08 to 09. With now it's, instead of have enough talent to play, it's how much can you pay to play. That fundamentally changed the sport because then teams got used to two different revenue streams, one from a sponsor, one from a driver or a wealthy family in the development ranks. That drove the cost to compete up significantly to the point that now, in 2011, even though sponsors are spending again, they're not spending at 07 levels, but they're spending at circa 04 levels. The cost to compete has been driven outside of the range of what you can do just with sponsorship. So without some level of private capital, you just can't break into the series. The net of that is that unless you have private capital as a developing driver, you can't just make it on talent anymore. It's been like that for a number of years, and that has a big effect on the sport as a whole. So specifically on the Sprint Cup Series, our top series, the result of the talent pipeline being filled with more money skewed as opposed to talent skewed is that when you look at Sprint Cup Rookie of the Year classes by year, you had an average of 4 from 2000 through 2007 or so. And ever since then, it's just been a steady decline to the point that last year, 2011, there was one rookie, Andy Lally. Andy didn't even compete in all the races and is not back in the series this year. That's a function of a number of things, but the biggest of which being how much the talent pipeline has changed. So coming out of that, where does that leave our sport? Something similar to this happened in the Indy Racing League, where an influx of drivers from outside the country with money started to use the IRL as this breeding ground, if you will, for Formula One. One of the net effects of that was an influx of foreign drivers, a loss of a lot of American interest in the sport. That obviously hurt the IRL a tremendous amount. From a fan interest perspective. While we're not at that level and nowhere close, it does beg some questions about how do we maintain relevance of the driver population to the fan population and what workarounds do we create. So in our particular case, Darryl and I, and this is a whole other thing for a whole other presentation, but Darryl and I and a few others created a venture where basically investors buy an equity stake in a driver's career and that funds, in this case, my career. And that funds that development. So there's numerous other ways around it. But that, in a nutshell, is where the sport is at. When you look at the truck series today, you don't see any drivers that are there unless they have some form of private capital outside of traditional means of sponsorship. So with that, I've tried to kind of get through the deck. I don't know if anybody had any questions. Feel free to ask.
I grew up with the short
He's got a mic. He's got a mic.
I grew up watching the short tracks in central Wisconsin and northern Illinois, and that used to be the breeding ground. In fact, there's a number of the older NASCAR drivers now, Mark Martin comes to mind immediately, that I got to watch 3-4 times a year on the short tracks. Those tracks are still there and they're still functioning, but I haven't been back for a long time. Is that a breeding ground now for the drivers? regardless of financing.
It certainly is. And those short tracks are mostly sanctioned by NASCAR, and they're part of the Whelen All-American Series. That's what I did, 07, and I won the championship in this series. I did it in 08. The problem exists in the fact that you can't climb the ladder just based off talent. There's, if we were to, so this is the whole, group of sanctioned series. But if you were to look at this as a ladder of actual climbing and say, okay, well, what gets you from this series to this series and this series to this series? You find that there's a gap where you can only climb so high before you hit the ceiling of quite literally, do you have private capital, yes or no? And if the answer is no, you're not going to get above that line right there. So is it still a breeding ground? Yes, but the system is not such that it's solely dependent on talent now. It's in fact much more heavily skewed towards dependent on financial resources than dependent on driving ability.
So I'm assuming NASCAR is aware of this. What is NASCAR doing outside of your own venture, which I would say that maybe isn't so irrelevant to another topic? If you could talk a little bit more about that, and also, I guess, address the question of what exactly NASCAR is doing right now.
Yeah, sure. So from NASCAR's perspective, NASCAR, and if anybody watched the Daytona 500, you probably saw some of what NASCAR calls their home tracks commercials. And that's been trying to drive more interest, fan interest at some of these levels in the hopes that more fan interest will mean more sponsor value, and that more sponsor value will mean more sponsors, and that more sponsors will mean more opportunities for young developing drivers. The problem is that still doesn't get you around the inefficiency. Because, let's face it, we're all competitors. And to go back to the earlier point, NASCAR as a private company in a non-franchise sport doesn't have the ability to create salary caps or spending caps. And if they were to create them, they really have no functional way to police them. The net of that is that they really don't have control. They can direct, they can nudge, but they can't maintain control. Because even if they do direct more sponsorship and more fan interest, well, that's great. Now if I'm racing in this series and I'm spending, $1 million of private capital and $2 million of sponsors, and you tell me that there are more sponsors in there, and now I'm going to get all $3 million in sponsors, I'm going to say, great. I'm going to take my $3 million of sponsors and my $1 million of private capital, and I'm just going to spend another $1 million on R&D, and I'm going to beat the guy who doesn't have that much money. So it's really a bigger picture functional problem in the sport because there is no spending limit. You can always spend more on R&D, and there's always more things to do. Some of the, you guys would laugh certainly if I told you some of the places we've spent money doing research and development, out at proving grounds. I've been at it all Toyota, Chevy, Ford, and Chrysler's proving grounds out in Arizona, just testing all kinds of different aerodynamic things and whatnot. We'll always spend that. So functionally, that's always going to exist. What NASCAR's trying to get around it will help, but NASCAR is not in a position, at least right now, unless they were to make some kind of very different and large-scale initiative to actually change that system. So to answer the second part of your question, what our venture is essentially an LLC that exists. And in its simplest form, I have an exclusive services agreement with that LLC. The LLC effectively owns my racing career at some level. And investors purchase an equity stake in that career because in my perspective, I grew up in a middle-class family. I don't have that private capital. So that capital raise comes from selling effectively equity in my career like a golf or a tennis model might be.
Are other drivers of your age, your station, are they following you? Are they doing this as well? Or are you sort of unique?
So at this point, I'm unique in that. LLCs in and of themselves are common for drivers to have just for liability reasons, for business reasons. But as far as doing it, we've done it in a really formal way, such that this LLC exists. The LLC has a board that decides how the capital gets spent. Various reporting mechanisms back to investors. Done right, like a business. Some drivers have kind of done the sign of something on a napkin with a rich guy kind of thing. That's worked well in some cases and not so well in others. Now the vision for this venture, as I'm certain if Darryl were here, he would talk more about, is Darryl's vision is, okay, let's create a portfolio of drivers. In Darryl's mind, I'm somewhat the test case, I suppose. And supposing this venture can work and drive the returns that we believe that it will, to develop that into a portfolio outside of just me.
So this is a model that's been used in other sports. Golf is a pretty good example. I think you could talk about other country club sports following a similar model. So is your concern the fact that the capital is not finding the drivers, or simply that people who might have been able to make an impact in NASCAR, say if they'd come along 10 years ago no longer have access to tracks and to experience? Or, I mean, I'm trying to figure out, are you saying that there's a new model, or that the sport is losing something because younger drivers don't have access to traditional paths of development?
In a way, both. So I think you asked, is the sport losing something? And then B, is there a new model? So to answer your first part of the question, there is a potential for the sport to lose something. Don't forget, as a sport, I mean, you look at baseball, right? You've got 40-man rosters, 30 franchises, 1,200 athletes. The Sprint Cup Series, there's 43 guys. That's the cap NASCAR sets on how many cars can start a race. So the driver turnover rate is really, really low. So it takes a while for that institution to shift. Is there a potential for some of these risks to the sport as a whole? Yeah, there's a potential for that. Is this a new business venture, a new model, a new idea that would in many ways alleviate that? Yes, it would. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. But I guess it just seems like one more step in, I don't want to get too broad, but sort of NASCAR escaping its roots, as it were, sort of a rural, activity that accesses a certain fan demographic that is very different from golf.
Mhm.
And it seemed like you're applying the golf model to NASCAR. And that seems perfectly fine, but I'm wondering if there's no loss of nostalgia as well.
Without a doubt. That's a very real risk to the sport as a whole, and I think that's a risk that our sport has faced for probably the last 15 years. As the sport grew and as companies started spending more money, companies spent more money, and they wanted every driver to make sure that they towed the corporate line, and we ended up with potentially the most vanilla sport there was, because we all had to stand up there and say, the Coca-Cola Ford was awesome thanks to the guys at the shop, and everybody just said the same damn thing. And we've slowly kind of realized that, well, maybe that's not the best idea, and maybe that is alienating fans. And NASCAR as a sanctioning body has kind of loosed the reins, and sponsors have kind of realized that, okay, maybe that's not the best way to go about it to really drive returns. So that's something that's existed in our sport for a while, and that have been conscious of. And I mean, hell, the Daytona 500 ended up airing on a Monday night after a Sunday afternoon scheduled start, and was the second highest Daytona 500 in history in TV ratings. So in a sense, where there was a real concern about where are we headed as a sport, what we saw in 2011 and then what we're already seeing in 2012 is showing that the sport very much is rebounding as we reconnect with that core fan at a level in which they still relate to the sport as, kind of this down home, back to its roots, if you will. Is that it?
Yeah.
Oh, do we have time for one?
Well, give it one quick.
Yeah.
So at what level, in your model, at what level do the numbers work? Because you're still talking about $3 million.
Yep.
And the Craftsman, you guys, Daytona is the biggest payday. Did the winner get a couple $100,000? Maybe. So given the capital intensive, the travel.
So at what level does the model work? At what level does the model derive returns? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. From an investor's perspective, do you need to make it to nationwide, to Cup,
Sprint
or
Cup.
at what level?
Sprint Cup. I mean,
So
there
this
is very little, if any, money to be made at the Truck Series level, and there's no anticipation whatsoever that investors will see any significant returns. They won't even. I mean, they're not even going to get their money back if I don't get beyond this level. It's dependent on getting to the Sprint Cup Series. Now, when you get to the Sprint Cup Series, the fact that there's such a small number of athletes means that as a sport, if you look at what the average athlete makes in every major league, NASCAR's by far, I mean, legions ahead of every other, or Arsenal's ahead of every other sport. Just because there's such a small number of athletes, the money is concentrated to such a small group of guys, and now Danica. So in that regard, the winner of the Daytona 500, Matt Kenseth, I think the Daytona 500 paid $1.6 million to the winner, and drivers get anywhere from 30 to 50% of that. Plus a salary, plus endorsement deals. So we'll take Dale Earnhardt Jr. because he's certainly an anomaly. But second and third on the earnings list of NASCAR, Jeff Gordon and Jimmy Johnson at $25 and $23 million apiece. And even down to 10th on the list is $11 million a year between salary, percentage of winnings, and endorsement deals. I know you want me to wrap it up. Yes. So thank you guys. Appreciate it.